In the spring of 1848, 5 men in Beaufort District, South Carolina, Judge Cornelius Rutledge and his 5 adult sons, were found alive but mutilated in their estate outside Bluffton. Newspapers said house fire. The medical examiner's report vanished. For 70 years, families who knew the truth never spoke the name of Isaac, the enslaved man who disappeared that same night, leaving behind a leather journal that would later surface in a courthouse basement and force a reckoning. This wasn't a tale about a lone monster. It was about a community's collective shame. What drives an educated enslaved man to an act so calculated, so surgically methodical, that even those who opposed slavery could not bring themselves to tell the real story? Fair Haven, Power, Cotton, and the Lie of Refinement. Beaufort in 1848, sat glittering on Sea Island cotton money, close enough to Charleston to copy its manners, far enough to breed its own codes of silence. Spanish moss hung like old secrets from live oaks. The marsh breathed pluff mud at low tide. And Fair Haven, 800 acres bent along the May River, stood like a courthouse that didn't need a judge to convict. Judge Cornelius Rutledge, 62, was a man of sentences and signatures, gallows orders, auction approvals, and a second vocation people whispered about: medical procedures that made him quietly richer than Cotton ever could. His 5 sons were an apparatus, each a different tooth in the same gear. Cornelius Jr., 41, the overseer mind with a ledger for a heart, called Little Judge behind his back. Thomas, 38, Thursday visitor and the father's medical innovation apprentice. William, 35, Charleston lawyer, keeper of legal fictions when human beings were the property in dispute. Robert and James, twins, 28, entitled Volatile, Cruel for Sport, where the older brothers weaponized order, the twins weaponized boredom. Every Thursday came the consultations. Boys' club meetings turned into something else entirely. Locked doors, lowered voices, and sometimes screams that the morning swallowed. Isaac, the shadow who kept the numbers and the names. Isaac, 36, lived close to the house and far from everyone. His mother, Abigail, the judge's father's housekeeper, somehow learned to read and secretly taught her son. Letters before dawn, numbers by candle, Latin whispers caught from parlors. When she died in 1831, grief betrayed Isaac's skill. He sorted receipts by date and vendor without thinking. The judge saw it, didn't sell him south, hired him, cheaper than a white bookkeeper, and far easier to threaten. The enslaved called Isaac the judge's shadow. They mistrusted what they could not afford to understand, that by day he kept official ledgers, and at night he wrote another book, a thin leather journal hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. Columns of chemicals ordered: carbolic acid, laudanum, chloroform. Lists of instruments purchased from Baltimore and Philadelphia: forceps, scalpels, speculums. Names of girls and women, ages 13 to 16, dates, outcomes. A single recurring word: procedure. 26 survivors noted, 12 who died. He wrote it all because numbers tell the truth men hide. He wrote because witnessing is sometimes the only rebellion available. Thursday, May 4th, 1848, the Last Supper. The 5 sons assembled at Fair Haven. Supper was roasted duck, rice, early greens. Isaac served the table, present and invisible, an art honed by survival. He caught fragments, complications with the last one, legal risks if word reached Charleston. The judge's hand cut the air. Enough. We'll discuss afterward. He turned to Isaac. Coffee at 9. Then we are not to be disturbed. Isaac had already moved. 2 hours earlier, he'd picked the lock on the medicine cabinet and bled laudanum into the judge's Thursday whiskey. Not to kill, high precise dosing, but to sink 6 men into the bottom of sleep. He waited, listened to the murmur below his room, the scrape of chairs, the smothered chuckle, the confidence of men whose only fear is being discovered by equals. At 9, he carried in the silver tray. He saw the judge's eyes a fraction slower, the sun's already softened. "Leave it," Rutledge said. "Go to bed." Isaac closed the door, climbed softly to his room, and pulled out a canvas bag. A straight razor, stropped until it could split a hair. Clean cloths. A small bottle of carbolic acid, purchased with a forged note in the judge's hand. Surgical thread, lifted a spool at a time so no one would notice the loss. He waited 2 more hours in the empty kitchen house. The fire banked low. Insects rasped. Somewhere an owl called. His hands were steady now. Fear had burned away and left only purpose. The study. Near 11, he eased the study door. 6 men, the judge and sons, lay contorted in their chairs, drunk on whiskey and sleep. Isaac shut the door and locked it from inside. He turned up the lamp. He opened the judge's instrument cabinet with a lock he'd learned months ago, and set the tray beside the brass desk lamp. He moved with the precision of the very manuals Rutland had used to perfect his techniques. He would use their language, tools, and logic against them. He began with Cornelius Rutland. No hurry. Clean with carbolic. Cut with care. Suture as texts recommend. He'd planned for survival. Not a quick end, but a long understanding. Then Cornelius Jr., Thomas, William, the twins last. The only sounds were breath and linen. A soft groan now and then as laudanum let dreams flicker, then drown again. He felt no triumph. This was justice, not joy. The distinction mattered to him even if history would never grant it. By 3 in the morning, he was done. He washed his hands in the kitchen basin and watched the water run pink then gray. He changed into homespun clothes set aside weeks ago, took the hollowed Bible with the journal, shouldered the canvas bag, and stepped into that hour before dawn when even the birds consider their first song. He did not look back. At the edge of the fields, where cultivation becomes forest, he breathed 3 times and vanished into the pines toward the Savannah River, toward a freedom purchased with an act so terrible and precise that it would take decades for anyone to tell the truth. Morning. The official lie begins. At 7, Martha came to light the fires. The study door was locked from inside. The men's groans answered her knocks. 2 field hands broke the door. 6 men conscious now, bleeding, screaming, weeping. A note sat on Isaac's small desk upstairs, left where it would be found. A list of 26 names with dates, and a single sentence at the bottom in his fine, careful hand. You made them unable to bear children. Now you share their fate? The judge ordered the note burned. He forbade anyone to speak of it. Writers bolted in all directions. 1,000 reward if captured alive. $500 for proof of death. A fortune in 1848. Bounty hunters searched ships, stopped wagons, loosed hounds. The scent died at the Savannah River. Behind curtains, another machinery began. 3 physicians, Crenshaw of Beaufort, Dillingham, and Finch from Charleston, stabilized the men, then conspired. Journals burned. Instruments smashed and buried under quicklime. Correspondence destroyed. The 26 surviving women were sold south, scattered. Their testimony atomized across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. The newspapers printed exactly 3 sentences. No details. No names of women. Only the lie. A trusted Negro went mad. Assaulted a family, fled. But in the quarters, the truth traveled without paper. Isaac's doctrine. Witness is a weapon in Philadelphia. Weeks later, an educated hand addressed an envelope to the Charleston Mercury. Inside were copy pages of the judge's medical logs. Names, ages, dates, outcomes. And a letter. I did not flee from justice, but toward it. I used their techniques and let them live, so they would understand. Call it justice or vengeance. Both are wrong and both are right. Sometimes all that's left when mercy is beaten out of the world is truth on paper. The editor locked the documents in his safe. He never published, but he never destroyed them. For decades, truth would live in ledgers, basements, and memories. On after, order the color of ash. The morning they broke the study door, crisis arrived dressed as procedure. Overseers barked. House slaves ran with basins and cloths. A rider galloped for Dr. Thaddeus Crenshaw, Beaufort's steady hand. When the physician stepped into the room, his face didn't change. Men like him learned to keep their features calm so other men wouldn't panic. But the calm was a lid. Beneath it, something boiled. He dosed laudanum, cleaned wounds, bandaged with a speed that suggested practice. He sent for 2 Charleston colleagues, Dr. Robert Dillingham and Dr. Howard Finch, the kind of doctors planters trusted when money and reputation bled as freely as flesh. By noon, the house smelled of carbolic and fear. By dusk, silence had returned, not the silence of peace, but the careful hush used to smother scandal. When Martha handed Crenshaw the paper from Isaac's desk, 26 names in the line, "You made them unable to bear children. Now you share their fate," the doctor read it twice. Then he looked at the judge, who lay in bed staring at the ceiling as if the plaster might supply a different world. Crenshaw folded the note, passed it to Rutledge. The judge's fingers trembled for the first time anyone remembered. "Burn it," he said. The hearth obeyed. It would not be the last fire. 3 physicians, 1 decision. They met 11 days later in Crenshaw's Beaufort study, away from Fair Haven's stained air. Crenshaw poured whiskey he didn't drink. Dillingham sat like a man at a court-martial. Finch paced, then stopped, then paced again. On the desk, a stack of papers no one should have had. Isaac's journal, found hidden in a hollow Bible, recovered by a nervous housemaid who thought a book should be with the others. The journal listed chemicals ordered, instruments purchased, payments received, names of girls, dates, outcomes. Every entry neat as prayer, every page an indictment. Finch said, "We can't bury this." Dillingham said, "We must." Crenshaw said nothing for a long time. Then he confessed. He had purchased the judge's service twice. 2 young women on his place had been too fertile. He'd called it necessity. He'd told himself the numbers made sense. He had used the language of economy to launder cruelty. Finch sat. Dillingham exhaled as if the verdict had finally been spoken. Crenshaw proposed their compromise, the sort that soils everyone equally so no one moves. The public story would be madness. A literate slave confused by reading, who attacked, then fled. Vague injuries. Nothing surgical, no women. The judge's journals would burn. The instruments would be smashed and buried. Any letters to and from other planters found and destroyed. The enslaved women who'd survived the procedures, sold south, scattered so widely that no court, no church, no conscience could assemble their testimonies in a single room. Dillingham nodded like a man choosing the rope over the bullet. Finch wept once, quickly, then agreed. They wrote a letter, May 18th, 1848, explaining to the future why they had lied in the present, sealed it with 2 lawyers' signatures, and locked it where truth goes to wait. The cover-up had a date, a plan, and a price. The first to pay it would not be the guilty. Fires at Fair Haven. The bonfire began with books. Journals first, thick with the judge's precise script. Diagrams so careful they could have been saints' faces if saints had ever been summoned to such work. Finch stood nearest the hearth, eyes watering, forcing himself to inhale the smoke. Penance through lungs. Next came instruments, forceps, scalpels, clamps. The metal gospel of men who called themselves rational. They were smashed, buried with quicklime. The earth tamped flat as if severity could be made level again. Then the correspondence. Letters from 3 circuit judges, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, written in careful legal daylight about population control. A Georgia judge had dared write, "Imagine the savings." The reply in the judge's hand, "Mortality now 1 in 8, acceptable." Those letters did not burn at Fair Haven. Someone, no one later could say, who, carried them quietly to the courthouse and slid them behind. A wall that wasn't there the year before. Truth prefers basements. Lies love front porches. The women were next. Not to a fire, something colder. Sally was already dead. Jessie lived bent. Clara Simmons could still walk. 26 survivors were inventoried like barrels. Ages, temperament, teeth. Then sold, one by one, wagon by wagon, to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Children pulled from arms, names torched and replaced with new ones, because erasure is a tool sharper than any knife. Beaufort society exhaled. The judge's shutters closed. The twins rode with patrols and beat other men's runaways like it could undo a single dawn at Fair Haven. And in town, respectable mouths practiced a new lie until it felt like weather. The official story. Charleston Courier printed 3 sentences on May 20th. A trusted Negro belonging to Judge C. Rutledge of Beaufort became deranged and attacked members of the family before absconding. The Beaufort Tribune added that the fugitive could read and write, a warning disguised as a description. No article named a woman. No ink carried Sally or Jessie or Clara to the page. The press performed the ritual they were built for. turn a crime into rumor and a victim into silence. But in the quarters, a truer press ran at night. Stories said in whispers, typeset by breath. Isaac used the master's own knives. He didn't kill them. He let them live so they could know. The reaction in the cabin split three ways: praise, fear, and the third thing without a clean name. Sometimes terrible meets terrible, and neither cancels the other. Isaac at Sea Isaac didn't drown in the Savannah River. He found a boat, Quakers in Savannah with a legitimate shipping firm and an illegitimate conscience. 11 days in a cargo hold, counting by thumps and rat steps, breathing through a board drilled with 3 holes. June in Philadelphia. Free air that still smelled like other people's ovens. The 7th Ward took him in. He chose a new name men forgot by morning but numbers remembered by night. He kept books for a black-owned dry goods business and never stood in doorways where travelers from Charleston might squint and say, "Aren't you?" Freedom didn't quiet his ledger. It multiplied it. He began writing letters to shadows, inquiring through safe hands about 26 women scattered like seeds in a wind the South had prayed for. By 1855, he'd located 17. 4 were dead. 13 breathed on plantations whose names could teach a child to hate. Choctaw Bend, Doghead Crossing, 7 Oaks. Isaac sent money, small at first, then larger because sometimes mercy folds and posts. One of those women, Clara Simmons, spoke to a northern Quaker named Patience Hathaway in 1853. Hathaway's journal recorded a girl taken at 13 to a room where men waited. "They said it was for our own good," Clara told her. "I wanted a baby so bad I could taste it in my dreams." When she heard what Isaac had done, she cried 2 days, not for sorrow, for something that might be hope. Hathaway hid her notebooks until 1891, when the country was tired enough of truth to let a small amount in. A safe that wouldn't swallow in Philadelphia. Isaac copied pages from the judge's journals by hand, each line in the judge's own precise structure, but in Isaac's beautiful script. He addressed an envelope to the Charleston Mercury. "Attention, Harrison Pettigrew." The cover letter was a blade with a scholar's balance. "I did not flee from justice, but toward it. I used their techniques. I let them live. You will not publish this. I know the world we live in. I send it so that someone, somewhere, knows these women suffered, and that their suffering did not pass entirely without consequence." Pettigrew read the packet twice, then felt his belt tighten. He summoned Crenshaw. The doctor confirmed authenticity and begged silence. Pettigrew could already see the riot that truth would light. He locked the documents in his personal safe and made an error that would save everything later. He forgot to destroy them. When Pettigrew died in 1869, his daughter, tidying her father's papers for the Charleston Historical Society, boxed the packet labeled "Correspondence, Medical Matters, 1849. It slept, misfiled but alive. What the doctors couldn't kill. The judge resigned that August, calling it health. No public explanation. Nights brought nightmares. He called out girls' names in fever: Sally, Jessie, Clara, and promised a father who wasn't there that next time the technique would be cleaner. Crenshaw increased laudanum until repentance went quiet. Rutledge died in 1851, a mind chewed down to its nubs. Cornelius Jr. lost interest in Rose and Rot. Yield slipped. Discipline became accident instead of policy. Thomas moved home and sat on the veranda facing the river like a man trying to outstare water. William drank the practice out of his hands. The twins rode rage into the night with patrols until one died in 1852. A runaway turned and made the story two-sided. The other sank into a depression the old doctors called melancholia. Modern names would be harsher and more exact. The plantation peeled, cracked, and softened. Repairs waited and then forgot what they were for. Freedmen later told their children to keep away from Fair Haven, not because of ghosts, but because memory makes its own quicksand. 1849. A letter north, a thunder kept in a drawer in November 1849. The Charleston Mercury received a packet postmarked Philadelphia. Inside, Isaac's copies of the judge's procedure logs, 43. Cases in those years alone, and that letter. That could have been ammonia or sacrament, depending on your heart. Pettigrew held publication in one hand and order in the other. He chose order, but he made notes. He told Dr. Crenshaw what he'd done and instructed him. Keep your letter as well. Let the future decide what the present cannot. It would take 34 years to decide. The courthouse wall in 1883. A construction crew renovating the Beaufort courthouse discovered a false wall and a metal box. Inside, correspondence between Judge Rutledge and other circuit judges. Phrases no acid can clean. Imagine the cost savings. Mortality at 1 in 8 acceptable. Standardize the technique. The crew foreman, a Union veteran named Patrick Donnelly, walked the papers to the Beaufort Tribune, now edited by Abraham Wallace, a formerly enslaved man who had learned letters under a tent with a Bible and a bayonet for a desk weight. Wallace printed a careful piece on December 12, 1883. Within a week, threats crawled out from porches. Someone broke in and stole the documents. The courthouse said, "What documents?" Donnelly left the state with unexpected money. Wallace kept the story alive with ink alone. Truth had now escaped twice. Isaac's last work, a well-dressed black man, came to Beaufort in 1877, spoke with a northern edge, asked about the sons, about the instruments, about women sold south. He visited the slave cemetery, laid a hand on unmarked earth the way a man measures rain. Before he left, he donated $1,000 to a black school with instructions. Teach reading and numbers, yes, but also accounting. Teach them to read the lies that call themselves ledgers. Teach them that documentation is resistance. He didn't sign the letter. He didn't have to. Years later, someone compared that script to the 1849 Mercury letter and felt something old click into place. Between 1865 and 1902, an anonymous donor funded schooling for 42 young women from the Low Country. Many descended from plantations near Beaufort. Suggested fields, medicine, law, accounting, the professions that unmask numbers and arm truth. The payment stopped in 1902. If it was Isaac, he would have been 90. Sometimes justice isn't a gavel, it's a scholarship. The record keeper arrives in 1922. A researcher from Fisk, Margaret Finley, came south with a spine like rebar and a notebook like a net. She found Wallace's 1883 article, Crenshaw's sealed 1848 letter, Hathaway's testimonies, and, at last, Pettigrew's packet misshelved in Charleston. She assembled what the men had tried to keep disassembled and published in 1924 in the Journal of Negro History. Her last paragraph refused a cheap moral. Isaac's actions were brutal and illegal, inside a system more brutal and less legal than any courtroom will admit. He maimed 6 men who sterilized 62 women, killed 12, and planned a program for a region. He used their techniques to grant them understanding. History may not pardon him, but it cannot condemn him alone without condemning those who chose silence over truth. The ledger that lied about birth, the law that made Isaac's revenge possible, was old and simple. Partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the condition of the mother. That line, imported from Virginia into every Southern code, was meant to fix slavery to the womb. If a mother was enslaved, her child could never be free. But men like Judge Rutledge found another use for it. With the right paperwork, a white father could claim a child as property, if that child was said to have been born of an enslaved woman. Between 1840 and 1848, Rutledge perfected this legal alchemy. He falsified birth ledgers, assigning black mothers to infants who were not theirs. The real mothers, his own daughters or the daughters of his peers, disappeared behind clerks' handwriting. To the county records, these were mulatto children of unknown paternity. To their real mothers, they were the sin no church could baptize, the girls behind the numbers. The 26 names on Isaac's list weren't random. They were survivors of that paper machinery. Each name carried 2 births, one of flesh and one of fiction. Their children were taken, labeled, sold, or buried before they reached 5. Sally, 15 years old when she was treated for hysteria. She died 3 days later, buried under a cypress near the edge of the marsh. Jessie, 17, survived the procedure but could never carry again. Clara Simmons, 14, the only one who saw the ledger with her own name crossed out. In her own trembling hand, she once wrote, "They said I was unfit. The doctor said I was saved. But I think something holy left me that night and never came back. Years later, when interviewed by a missionary, Clara said she dreamed of paper women, ghosts who carried children for others and vanished from the record. We were mothers on paper, she said, but not in life. The sails south after Isaac's rebellion, the planters panicked. Evidence walked, so they made sure it didn't walk far. The 26 women were cataloged like items at an auction. In those ledgers, still preserved in fragments, the language is chillingly clean. Lot 7, female, 18 strong, minor scarring, compliant temperament. Lot 12, female, 16, barren, household experience. Lot 19, female, 17, childbearing capacity uncertain. The buyers came from Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. None asked why girls so young were marked barren. None cared. For them, this was economics, a correction of defective stock. For the women, it was exile wrapped in silence. But word travels where paper cannot. Across wagon roads and steamboats, they whispered to one another. He did it to his own blood. Maybe he'll never sleep again. That whisper became a kind of prayer. The letter that crossed the sea in 1853, one of those women, Clara Simmons, was sold to a doctor's household near Mobile, Alabama. Her new mistress, a widow from Boston named Eleanor Marsh, kept letters from abolitionist friends in London. Clara couldn't read, but she watched the letters come and go. One night she asked Eleanor, "If I tell you what happened, will you write it down?" And Eleanor did. Together they wrote a 7-page account, signed only CS, detailing the procedures, the forced sterilizations, and the falsified births. Eleanor mailed it to Samuel Gurney, a Quaker philanthropist in England. It arrived, was read, and quietly archived, a document too inflammatory for polite abolitionist pamphlets. But it didn't die. It would later resurface in 1872, and again in 1924, in Margaret Finley's article, the one that finally named Isaac, that single act of trust, an enslaved girl speaking to a woman who dared to listen, kept the truth alive for 70 years. Isaac's hidden. Correspondence while the Rutledges buried their crimes. Isaac was creating his own paper trail. From Philadelphia, he sent coded letters through merchants and dock hands. To outsiders, they were accounting reports, lists of shipments and expenses. To those who knew the cipher, they were updates on the missing women. Shipment delayed to Mobile. Invoice 7 meant Clara still alive. Losses recorded near Yazoo Bend meant 2 deaths. By 1856, Isaac had compiled the first unofficial record of Southern medical exploitation, a grim, secret census written in ink and gilt. He titled it in Latin, Mulieris Silentium, the Silence of Women. Only 2 copies are known to have existed. One vanished in a house fire in 1863. The other was found, scorched but legible in 1901, beneath a collapsed church floor in Beaufort. It began with a line that still cuts like a blade. When they said we were property, I proved they were wrong. Because only the living can bear witness, and only witnesses make history. The cost of remembering, cutting 1856, the South was restless, the air heavy with a war still unspoken. But on plantations like Fair Haven, another war had already been fought and lost. The war over truth. The daughters of the Rutledge family were ghosts in their own home. Joanna, the judge's wife, had taken to her bed, claiming illness that was really remorse. Of the 5 sons, only Thomas still prayed. In the town ledger for that year, there is an entry beside the Rutledge estate. Repairs suspended. Household diminished. No mention of why. No mention of the paper mothers who had once lived there, whose bodies carried the weight of law, shame, and survival. What paper couldn't contain when freedom finally came in 1865. None of those 26 women were alive to see it. But their children, or those stolen and renamed in ledgers, carried fragments of their story like inherited code. A freedwoman in Savannah once told a Union officer, "My mama's womb was taken, but her voice found me." He didn't understand, so she said it again slower. She couldn't bear children no more, so she made a story instead. And now I'm that story. The year the prayers stopped by 1857, the Rutledge Plantation was no longer a place of law, or learning, or power. It was a grave in disguise. The judge had retreated entirely into silence, his mind slipping somewhere between madness and memory. He was often found muttering names: Sally, Clara, Jessie, the names Isaac had written before vanishing. He rarely left his study. The same room where screams had once echoed, and where Isaac had ended the dynasty's bloodline, now smelled of chloroform and old whiskey. Servants said he spent his nights scratching words into the wooden walls. Latin phrases from legal texts, scripture fragments, half of them spelled wrong. When one of the slaves dared to clean the walls, she saw among the marks something written in Isaac's hand, carved deep. Impossible to scrub away. Nothing grows from salt. From that day, no one entered the study after sundown. The sons, heirs to a curse. Each son carried the ruin differently. Cornelius Jr. still ran the plantation, though ran was a word said more out of habit than truth. He kept the books neat but the fields wild. Workers learned that he punished rarely, not from mercy, but from exhaustion. Every night he sat at the same desk his father had once ruled over and whispered the same phrase: "He did this because of me." He drank to forget. But the problem with forgetting is that it leaves empty space, and empty space echoes. Thomas, once the judge's favorite for his surgical talent, had become a ghost in daylight. He moved through the house with a scalpel in his pocket and a Bible in his hand, whispering verses backwards as though trying to rewrite God's opinion. He'd cut small shapes from paper, birds, stars, women's faces, and burn them in the fireplace every Thursday at midnight. The servants called it the doctor's mass. William, the lawyer, had fled to Charleston, but guilt is territorial. It follows its blood. Letters from him arrived covered in ink blots and apologies written, then crossed out. He begged his brothers to leave the Low Country, to sell Fair Haven, and never speak the family name again. No one replied. The twins, Robert and James, were worse. They turned their shame into rage. They joined slave patrols riding through the marsh at night, beating runaways, chasing shadows. They said they were defending order, but every lash was a question screamed into the dark. Why him? Why not us? By 1860, even the overseers had stopped pretending the plantation could recover. They left one by one, and Fair Haven, once the jewel of the May River, began to decay brick by brick, conscience by conscience. Joanna's silence, Joanna Rutledge, the judge's wife, had not spoken a full sentence in 6 years. After Isaac's disappearance, she withdrew to the East Wing, sleeping in a separate room, eating alone. She kept a portrait of her husband and 5 sons turned face down on the dresser. She was seen most often in the cemetery behind the house, sitting between 2 graves, one marked for Abigail, the judge's old housekeeper, and another unmarked mound the servants avoided. She would hum softly for hours, a tune no one recognized, until mosquitoes rose like black mist around her, and she'd finally stagger back inside. When she died in 1859, the judge refused to attend the burial. He locked himself in the study instead. Witnesses later said they heard him shouting scripture through the walls. The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children. It wasn't clear if he meant as a confession or a curse. The storm of 60 in November 1861. A hurricane swept across the South Carolina coast, a storm the locals later called the Judgment Wind. It tore open the roof of Fair Haven, ripped out entire walls, and exposed what the family had buried for decades. The east cellar flooded, revealing a pit lined with broken surgical glass and rusted iron instruments. When the enslaved workers found it, they refused to continue repairs. One woman said she'd seen faces reflected in the water, women's faces, pale and watching. By morning, half the remaining laborers had fled into the swamps. That same night, lightning struck the live oak outside the main veranda. The trunk split cleanly down the middle, hollow inside, filled with bones no one could explain. The judge's sons ordered the remains reburied, but word spread through Beaufort faster than rainwater. Fair Haven was cursed. The Union comes. When Union troops marched through Beaufort later that same year, Fair Haven was already half empty. Cornelius Jr. tried to bargain, offering the estate as a field hospital to spare the house from destruction. The officers accepted. Within a week, Union surgeons were operating in the same study where the judge had performed his procedures. They noticed the strange carvings on the walls, names, numbers, Latin words. One young doctor, a lieutenant from Ohio, scribbled in his diary, "This place smells of blood even when it's clean." He didn't know how right he was. The soldiers burned the medical cabinets, repurposed the furniture, and hung their flags over the windows. But at night, the camp surgeon swore he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, like someone measuring distance in beats of guilt. The judge's last hours by early 1863. Judge Cornelius Rutledge was no longer lucid. He spoke to shadows, called out names of dead girls, and sometimes whispered Isaac's name as though expecting an answer. One morning, a nurse found him in his chair, smiling faintly. Blood dried around his mouth. He'd swallowed a handful of chloroform-soaked cotton, the same method he once used to silence screaming patients. Pinned to his desk was a single scrap of paper, written in shaky, deliberate letters. "Justice is not forgiveness," below it. A drawing, 6 stick figures standing in a circle, and one man walking away toward the trees. The townspeople called it suicide. But the house staff said something different. They said that around midnight, the study door opened by itself, though the lock was still turned from the inside. They said a cold wind passed through the halls, the kind that doesn't belong to weather. The house without God after the judge's death. Fair Haven became a monument to decay. Windows shattered. Ivy crawled across the bricks like veins. The study remained locked, not by key, but by fear. Visitors spoke of whispers under the floorboards, footsteps in empty corridors, and the faint metallic sound of surgical tools clinking in drawers long since removed. Preachers refused to bless the property, claiming no prayer could settle ground that had been fertilized with blood and denial. The freedmen of Beaufort began calling the ruins the house without God, and when children asked why, the elders would answer, "Because God left when they stopped hearing women scream." The quiet return on. The night of October 12, 1863, a freedman named Joseph Small saw a lantern moving near the ruins. He thought it was looters until he got closer. There, standing in the moonlight at the edge of the cotton field, was an older black man, thin, sharp-featured, holding a Bible. Joseph said he looked like someone who'd been carved out of grief and stitched back together with purpose. The man didn't run. He just said, "This house owes a debt to history." Then he walked toward the river and vanished into the mist. Joseph swore his name was Isaac. The investigation that never was. By spring of 1864, Union troops controlled most of the Beaufort district. The war was turning, and so were the records. Northern officers found Fair Haven a ruin of salt, smoke, and rumor. Among the wreckage in the judge's study, they discovered a metal ledger box hidden inside the chimney, locked, corroded, smelling faintly of oil and old parchment. When pried open, it revealed 3 items: a collection of birth certificates with falsified mothers' names, a correspondence log detailing procedures dated between 1840–1848, a single Latin phrase scrawled in the judge's handwriting. Ex silentio dominionem, from silence, control. Major Nathaniel O'Hare, the officer who led the inspection, sent the contents to the U.S. Bureau of Records in Charleston for evaluation. The documents never reached Charleston. Someone, no one could later say who, intercepted them along the route. That was the first cover-up. It would not be the last. The 3 men, who knew too much after the war. 3 men found themselves tied by guilt and survival to the Delaney crimes. Dr. Reuben McCormick, the physician who looked the other way. Sheriff Peter Mullins, who accepted Clement's story of bandits. And Major O'Hare, who had briefly handled the incriminating box. In 1868, McCormick was summoned to testify before a Reconstruction Commission investigating medical abuses of the enslaved. He never appeared. His carriage overturned on the Beaufort Road. Locals said the horse spooked. The investigators said he was silenced. When his effects were inventoried, his journal was missing, but a single page had been left inside his desk. "If I die suddenly, the papers will not have burned." Sheriff Mullins, retired and widowed, lived quietly until 1871, when a fire destroyed his home. He was found dead near the hearth, clutching a rusted revolver. Neighbors swore they heard footsteps and voices before the flames. His coroner's report listed the cause as accidental, but no lamp oil was ever found in the house. Major O'Hare, the last living witness, relocated to Boston in 1875. In a letter to his sister, he confessed to losing something that should have hung men higher than any gallows. He ended the letter with one cryptic line: "I hear knocking in my dream is like someone still wants out." He drowned in the Charles River 6 months later. The Bureau's convenient amnesia, though. Friedman's Bureau, overwhelmed by thousands of cases of abuse, quietly chose not to pursue Delaney's records. One clerk, Henry Worth, later testified that when he attempted to reopen the case in 1872, he was told by superiors, "Some stories are not fit for reconstruction." Worth persisted. He gathered letters, eyewitness accounts, and testimonies from former slaves who had lived at Delaney Plantation. But just as his report neared completion, he was transferred to Atlanta, his files misplaced in transport. Those documents were never seen again. In the Bureau's annual summary for that year, a single line replaced his entire report: "Plantation closed. Property repurposed. No further action recommended." The rewriting of history by 1875. Delaney's descendants, desperate to restore the family name, began rewriting their legacy. A pamphlet circulated through local churches titled "The Trials of the Delaney Family. Southern Tragedy." It painted Clement as a pious man, driven mad by Yankee debts and post-war persecution. His daughters were described as devout victims of war trauma, and the plantation was said to have been a model of Christian conduct. The pamphlet sold hundreds of copies across the South. The truth, hidden in sealed ledgers and unmarked graves, became folklore. Then gossip, then nothing. People prefer monsters they can forget. Meanwhile, freedmen who once worked the plantation told a different story, whispered under their breath during night services. He turned his own children into slaves, and the devil gave him sons to finish the job. Their version didn't sell, but it survived. Stories told by the powerless often do. The survivor's voice in 1878. A traveling journalist named Elias Partridge came to Beaufort collecting stories for his book, Echoes of the War South. At a Baptist mission house, he met an old woman who called herself Leah, once a housemaid at Delaney Plantation. She spoke in fragments, often trembling, but her memory was precise. "The master made us write lies. He said the babies were born to us, but they weren't. He said the girls upstairs had to pay for the land. He said God don't listen to women crying." Partridge included one paragraph of her testimony in his book, buried on page 314. The rest was cut by his publisher, who called it unsuitable for the public. That single paragraph was all that reached print, but it was enough for future historians to know Leah existed. Enough for someone to start looking again. The return of the ledger in 1882, during courthouse renovations in Charleston. A rusted lockbox was discovered sealed within a false wall, the missing one from Major O'Hare's convoy. Inside were 30 pages of Delaney's notes, anatomical sketches, menstrual charts, and detailed instructions for falsifying records of slave births. The discovery caused an uproar among Northern abolitionist circles, but in the South, it was met with denial. One Charleston newspaper dismissed the find as Yankee forgery meant to defame an honorable Southern gentleman. The papers were transferred to the state archives, where they were cataloged under a bland heading, Agricultural Records, 1850-1860. They stayed there for nearly a century. The last secret meeting in 1883. 3 surviving members of the Delaney family, Arlene, Caroline, and their mother Joanna, met privately in Savannah. Joanna was frail, nearly blind. The daughters, now women in their 40s, carried the invisible scars of what had been done to them. No minutes were kept of that meeting. But years later, a priest who heard Arlene's confession recorded her words. "We forgave our father because hell already had him, but we could not forgive the silence. It was the silence that killed Freda, not his hands." After that confession, Arlene disappeared from public record. Some say she entered a convent in New Orleans under another name. Others say she took a ferry north and never looked back. Only one thing is certain. The Delaney name died with them. History seals. Its lips by the end of the 19th century. Official history had done what it always does best. It forgot. The plantations rotted into soil. The ledgers yellowed in archives. The crimes became stories told to scare children. Then ghost tales told by tourists. But a few scholars, those who didn't fear the shadows of truth, kept digging. In 1924, when researcher Margaret Finley uncovered Isaac's letters and the old bureau files, she wrote in her paper, "History often calls silence peace, but peace without truth is only another form of bondage. And that's why this story, the one you're hearing now, still matters. Because every document burned, every witness silenced, every mother erased from a birth record, still whispers the same question: what price would you pay to stay innocent?" The woman who dug up the dead by the turn of the 20th century, Fair Haven Plantation was nothing but ruins, swallowed by vines, haunted by silence. Locals used its bricks for new houses. The land had been renamed Rosewood Preserve, as if a change of name could change its soul. Then came Margaret Elise Finley, historian, researcher, and daughter of a freed schoolteacher from Savannah. In 1901, she was cataloging Reconstruction-era legal archives in Beaufort County when she stumbled across a ledger fragment labeled simply Agricultural Records. Dating 60 inside, she found handwriting that wasn't agricultural at all. The entries weren't about crops or cotton yields. They were lists of women, followed by dates and single words: procedure, sterile, removed. Each line was clean, careful, meticulous. The same handwriting appeared across every page: C. Delaney, and beneath it, sometimes, the initials R.M., Dr. Reuben McCormick. It was the record of a crime that had been whispered for decades, and it had survived the fire, the lies, and the silence. Margaret Finley had just found the unearthed ledger. The ledger speaks. Margaret spent 2 nights reading in her rented room above a dry goods store, unable to sleep. The language was scientific, detached, but the horror lived between the lines. Subject number 14, age 16, recovery incomplete. Removal successful. Compensation remitted by Judge C.R. Subject number 21. Birth falsified. Infant reassigned under record number 97, no complications. Subject number 26, died of sepsis. Disposal handled in-house. Record closed. Every entry matched the whispered legend of Delaney Plantation, but this wasn't myth. It was evidence. Margaret realized what she held: proof of systemic sterilization, false motherhood ledgers, and the earliest known record of medicalized slavery in the Deep South. She wrote in her notes, "They didn't burn everything. Truth has a way of surviving even the flames of convenience." The missing names over the next 6 months. Margaret traced the names in the ledger to cemetery records and bill of sale archives. She discovered that 26 women had been sold out of Beaufort between 1848-1850, the same number recorded by Isaac before his disappearance. But something else stunned her. 2 of those names matched New Orleans hospital patient lists from the 1860s, women described as surgically barren. They'd survived. She followed the trail through church baptism logs, freedmen's papers, and faded census slips. One entry in a Methodist registry stopped her cold. Clara Simmons, colored woman, 56, domestic, educated in reading. Freed, 1865. Listed dependent of Isaac Freeman. Isaac Freeman, the alias under which Isaac had lived in Philadelphia. He hadn't just escaped. He'd found at least one of the women, freed her, and brought her north. Margaret closed her journal and wept. For the first time in 70 years, the ghosts of Fair Haven had names again. The war against truth Margaret's research should have made her a celebrated historian. Instead, it made her a target. When she submitted her early paper, Medical Abuses in the Slave South, the Delaney Files, to the Charleston Historical Review, the editor refused to publish it. He told her, bluntly, the South has suffered enough. Let its dead rest. A week later, her boarding room was searched. Her trunk rifled through. The ledger pages she'd kept hidden under false tax papers were gone. She found a single note on her pillow, unsigned, "We buried this once. Don't dig it up again." But Margaret didn't stop. If they would not print her words in Charleston, she would publish them elsewhere. Isaac's shadow returns in 1910. Margaret began corresponding with scholars at Howard University and Fisk University, academics collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people. Among their materials was a single anonymous donation dated 1877, a letter written in elegant handwriting, signed only I. The letter described a man's regret, his flight through the Savannah River, and his vow to fund the education of the descendants of those he could not save. It ended with a line Margaret recognized from Isaac's copied journal in the archives. "Let them learn to read the true story hidden in numbers." The realization left her shaking. Isaac had lived. He'd survived, rebuilt and quietly funded the schooling of freed Black women through donations sent under false names for decades. Margaret now understood. Her mission wasn't just historical. It was continuation. She was finishing what Isaac had begun. The 1924 publication, after 20 years of gathering testimony, letters, and evidence. Margaret finally published her research in 1924 in the Journal of Negro History under the title, "Justice Without Mercy: The Ledger of Fair Haven Plantation." The article shook academic circles across the country. She presented the sterilization records, the falsified births, the coded medical transactions, and the evidence of post-war cover-ups. She quoted Isaac's letter directly for the first time. "They called what they did science. I called what I did justice." Both were born of reason, but only one was born of pain. For every scholar who praised her courage, another condemned her for reopening wounds. Southern newspapers called her a liar, a propagandist, a Negro sympathizer spinning fairy tales of vengeance. But Margaret didn't care. She'd broken the wall of silence, and in doing so, she became the first person in history to name Isaac not as a fugitive, but as a witness. The curse of knowledge. In the final months of 1924, Margaret returned to the ruins of Fair Haven. All that remained were the foundation stones and the magnolia tree that once shaded the main house. She buried a sealed tin box at the site, containing copies of her research and a note that read, "For whoever finds this, tell the truth again, when the world is ready to listen." That box was unearthed in 1962 by a group of civil rights volunteers clearing the land for a memorial garden. Inside, still legible beneath the rust, were the final lines she ever wrote. "History does not forget. It waits, and when it wakes, it demands to be heard." Margaret Finley died 1 year later. In 1925, penniless, blacklisted from Southern institutions, and yet immortal in the archives. Epilogue: the ledger lives on today. The unearthed ledger rests in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Its ink brown, its edges burned. Visitors read it through glass, not knowing that every line was once written in fear and kept alive through defiance. A plaque beside it bears Isaac's final recorded words, preserved from his Philadelphia letter. "When they chained our bodies, we wrote. When they burned our words, we whispered. When they silenced our whispers, we taught our children numbers, because numbers remember even when men choose to forget." And beneath that plaque is another line, added by curators decades later, dedicated to Isaac, to the 26 forgotten women of Fair Haven, and to Margaret Finley, who refused to let silence win. The fire of 1931, the last standing walls of Fair Haven, didn't fall to time. They fell to fire. On October 22, 1931, a group of local boys hunting raccoons near the ruins reported seeing a man with a lantern enter what remained of the house. Minutes later, flames rose high enough to be seen from the Beaufort docks. By dawn, the plantation was ash and embers. No body was found, no footprints either, just the twisted remains of the old iron gate, blackened but unbroken. Locals said the fire burned too fast, too hot. For wood that old, one of the boys swore he heard something through the smoke, a voice reciting scripture. "The fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is." 1 Corinthians 3:13, the sheriff called it lightning. The townsfolk called it justice. But the freedmen who still lived near the river said only one name: Isaac, the stranger who asked for directions. In April 1932, just 6 months after the fire, an elderly black man arrived in Beaufort by train. He carried no luggage, only a Bible bound in cracked leather and a folded photograph of a magnolia tree. He asked a conductor where Fair Haven had stood. When told it had burned, he smiled faintly and said, "Then it's finally clean." A carpenter repairing the depot swore that same man visited the colored school later that day, donated an envelope of cash, and left a note that read, "Teach them to write it down. Truth dies when memory sleeps." He signed it simply, I. Freeman. After that, no one ever saw him again. Years later, a teacher at that same school, one Benjamin Smalls Jr., would recognize the handwriting from Margaret Finley's archive files. It was Isaac's. He would have been 87 years old, the keeper of the magnolia tree. When the fire scorched Fair Haven, one thing survived: the magnolia tree at the center of the courtyard. Its trunk was blackened, but its leaves still bloomed each spring. People began leaving offerings at its roots: candles, ribbons, scraps of paper with prayers written on them. They called it the Witness Tree. In 1935, a Works Progress Administration surveyor mapped the site and recorded the entry. Local superstition: old magnolia believed to be haunted, said to whisper names of women when wind passes through. That same year, a woman from Charleston named Evelyn Marsh visited the site with her mother. She later wrote in her diary, "The wind sounded like breathing. Mama said she heard someone say Clara. I heard Isaac." The diary is still kept in the Beaufort County Historical Society, under the label Private Reflections, 1935. The lost interview in 1942. Journalist Howard Drayton, working for the Atlanta Tribune, set out to write an article about southern ghost places. When he reached Beaufort, townspeople directed him to the remains of Fair Haven. He interviewed residents, preachers, even an elderly woman named Sarah Lya, claiming to be the granddaughter of one of the original housemaids. Sarah told him something no one had ever printed. "He came back, you know. The one who done it. He walked here one night. Real quiet, like a prayer walking," he said. "It's not vengeance if they remember." Then he kissed the ground and left. Drayton wrote the story. His editor killed it. The original manuscript survived, found decades later among his papers, with a single handwritten note across the title page: "They still don't want this told." War and shadows as World War II raged. America forgot its older wars. Fair Haven's story was buried again, this time under patriotism and progress. But not everyone moved on. A professor at Howard University, Dr. Lewis Carter, rediscovered Margaret Finley's 1924 article and began corresponding with surviving locals. One letter, from a teacher in Beaufort dated 1947, contained a photograph of a headstone. The inscription read, "Isaac Freeman, approx. In 1883, he freed others by truth. No one knew who paid for the headstone. It appeared overnight, placed beside the magnolia tree. Cemented in silence, Dr. Carter called it the only gravestone in the South for a man who never stopped running. The night the church bells rang on June 12, 1950, the bells of St. Helena Church, long disused, rang 13 times just before midnight. Witnesses saw no one inside. When parishioners entered the next morning, they found 6 chairs arranged in a circle and an open Bible on the pulpit. The passage was Isaiah 10:1-2. "Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed." Pinned to the Bible's page was a note written in that same deliberate script: "The debt is paid." The record stands. Authorities called it a prank, but one deacon, old enough to remember whispers of the plantation, said, "No prank writes like a ghost that learned Latin." The end of silence by 1950. What remained of Fair Haven was officially declared a historical hazard. Fenced off, unmarked. Developers wanted to clear it for farmland. The county denied the permit. The official reason was safety. The real reason was fear. A final WPA field note from that year reads, "Locals still refuse to plow the site. They say it's cursed ground, not because of ghosts, but because the earth remembers who it fed. And maybe it does, because when archaeologists excavated part of the foundation in the 1970s, they found something just beneath the magnolia tree, a charred brass lockbox, melted nearly flat inside, barely legible, was a single phrase etched into the metal: "Truth cannot be burned." The museum that refused the ledger in 1951, the remnants of the Fair Haven records were offered to the South Carolina Historical Museum. They refused. The curator's official letter said, "The materials present a distorted and inflammatory depiction of antebellum society." Unofficially, a staff member later admitted the truth. They were afraid of what would happen if people knew a judge, a church elder, and a doctor all conspired to mutilate women for profit. The papers were boxed, mislabeled, and sent to a warehouse in Columbia. There they sat, unopened for 20 years. But silence, as history has proven, is never permanent. The year the earth spoke in 1962. Civil rights volunteers clearing the Rosewood Preserve found a tin box buried beneath the old magnolia tree. Margaret Finley's final archive. Inside, carbon copies of her 1924 article. Pages from Isaac's journal. A single handwritten note. "To the generation that will not be told to hush." The discovery coincided with the height of the civil rights movement. Students from Howard and Fisk carried photocopies of those pages during marches and protest signs in Alabama and Georgia. You could see Isaac's words printed in black paint. When silence becomes law, resistance becomes duty. The South could no longer bury its ghosts. From history to revolution, by 1971, a young historian named Dr. Lewis Carter from Howard University reopened the case. He published The Ledger and the Lie, a monograph linking Fair Haven to the early roots of eugenics in America. He argued that the sterilization experiments of the 1840s were precursors to 20th century eugenics programs in North Carolina, Alabama, and even California. The public reaction was explosive. Southern newspapers branded him a Northern agitator. But women's rights groups saw something deeper, the long shadow of control that stretched from slave plantations to state hospitals. Dr. Carter received threats. His office was vandalized. But his work inspired congressional staffers to begin investigating federal sterilization policies. 2 decades later, his research would help expose the Mississippi appendectomy scandal, the forced sterilization of black women in the 20th century. Isaac's journal had become evidence, not of a ghost story, but of a pattern. The documentary that broke the silence in 1989. PBS aired a controversial film titled The Ledger, A Crime Against Creation. It combined Margaret Finley's papers, Isaac's writings, and reenactments of the plantation's final years. The documentary shocked America. Viewers wrote in saying they felt sick, angry, haunted. One scene, read from Isaac's last surviving letter, became iconic. "They said we were property, but property does not dream. And I dreamed of justice. That is how I know I was free long before I escaped." The documentary won a Peabody Award and was banned in South Carolina for 5 years. Even then, pirated copies circulated through libraries, churches, and classrooms under plain white covers marked "History Restricted." The DNA revelation in 2003, genetic researchers studying Low-Country ancestry made a discovery they didn't expect. 2 descendants of Beaufort families, one white, one black, shared an identical maternal haplogroup traced to a woman listed in Isaac's ledger. Her name, Jessie Cunningham, one of the procedure's earliest victims. That meant one of her children had survived, been hidden in records, and passed her line forward for 150 years. For the first time, living people could trace their blood directly to the names carved into those ledgers. When asked what it felt like, one descendant said, "It feels like history finally looked me in the eye and said, 'You belong to the truth.'" The national reckoning in 2010, the Smithsonian officially recognized the Delaney ledger as evidence of early reproductive crimes in American history. It was displayed behind bulletproof glass, next to a quote from Margaret Finley. "Every line of ink is a woman's scream turned into handwriting." Visitors began leaving flowers beneath the exhibit, not white lilies for purity, but red carnations for blood. Remembered, educators taught the story in schools. Poets wrote ballads about Isaac. Filmmakers compared him to biblical avengers. Fair Haven became more than a ruin. It became a mirror America still struggles to look into. The modern echo today. If you walk through the Rosewood Preserve, you'll find a plaque where the magnolia once stood. It reads, "Site of Fair Haven Plantation, 1812-1863 here." Men of power sought to own not just bodies, but birth itself. Here, one man chose truth over silence, and in doing so, freed generations unborn. Dedicated to Isaac and the 26 on certain humid nights, locals swear the air hums like breath, and if you stand still long enough, you'll hear faint voices, counting, whispering, reciting names like a roll call that never ends. No one is afraid anymore. The fear died with the silence. The final page of the ledger in 2021. Digital archivists restored the last surviving page of Isaac's journal. The ink had nearly vanished, but under infrared light the words emerged. His final entry before disappearing in 1877. "I have written enough for the world to remember. What I took, I cannot return. What they took, I cannot forgive. But if anyone should read these pages, know this: truth is not mercy, but it is the only thing that heals." Those were his last known words, and perhaps the truest ones ever written about America's oldest wound.